In topic 1, we're going to be looking at angles of elevation. Basically, this topic is just going to be using SOHCAHTOA. So here's a little bit of a refresher of what SOHCAHTOA stands for. The acronym SO stands for, well, the S stands for sine. So I'll put the sine of x, x being an angle, and then is equal to, the O stands for opposite, and the H stands for hypotenuse. Ka, the C stands for cosine, so I'll put the cos of x. So cos of an angle is equal to the adjacent side, that's the A, over the hypotenuse, which is the H. And then finally, TOA, the T stands for tangent, so I'll put the tangent or the tan of x is equal to opposite over adjacent. So we're going to be using these trig ratios to solve questions on this topic. But first, let's try these at the top. So the first one says, which is the measure of the angle of elevation? So whenever we're talking about an angle of elevation, pretend that you're like a little person standing there, and the angle is going to be, well, pretend you're looking straight ahead. So right like that. And then you look from straight ahead upwards. And then you stop looking somewhere up here. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect this line to that point, and this angle in here, so this dotted line that you looked, is going to be the angle of elevation. So if we're looking at this triangle, they gave us two angles. They gave us one down here and one up here. We need to determine which one is the angle of elevation. So which one has it so that you're looking straight across and then up? So if we're standing over here and we were to have looked straight across, it would have gone out like this and then upwards. But that's clearly not happening over there. However, down here, if we had a little stick man, he is looking straight outwards and then up. So that there would be the angle of elevation. So I'm going to put 25 degrees. In the next one, it says, write an expression to use for calculating the angle of elevation. So then we have to determine what is the angle of elevation in this triangle. So where we look straight forward and then up would be down in this corner. If we put a little stick man, he would look straight ahead down here and then upwards, creating this angle of elevation in here. So how could we solve that angle? Well, this is where we have to think about SOHCAHTOA. Now, if we look at what sides of the triangle are given to us, they give us this 29 centimeters here and 33 centimeters up there. Now, the 33 centimeters is the hypotenuse of the triangle because it's right across from a right angle. That's the longest side, so it's the hypotenuse. And then the 29 centimeters, well, that's the side that's right beside the angle that we're dealing with. So we're dealing with this angle down there. So this side is right beside it, meaning it's adjacent to it. So this would be the adjacent side. So now we need to look and see which one of our trig ratios has an H in it and an A in it. So the one that has an H and an A would be cosine. Right there, it has an A and an H. So we know we're going to be using cosine. So then for this question, our answer would be the cos of x. We'll use x to represent this angle here. So this is angle x is equal to adjacent over hypotenuse. And if we put in some numbers, it would be 29 over 33. Then if we were to actually calculate that angle, well, what we would have to do is the inverse cos button, because here we're calculating an angle, so we need to use the inverse button on our calculator. So then in your calculator for this one, you would put inverse cos, or cos with that little -1 sign, and then you would do 29 divided by 33, and then you would get your answer for the degrees of that angle x. So let's look at this first example. It says, Arya builds roof trusses for a construction company in Medicine Hat. He needs to cut the ridge beam at an angle to attach it to the rafter. The cut angle must match the angle of elevation of the rafter, or x degrees. At what angle should Arya cut the ridge beam? And I don't know if I'm saying that name correctly, but that's okay. So what equation could we use to calculate the angle x degrees. So we're talking about the angle right there that they labeled for us. So let's zoom in and just check out the triangle we're dealing with. So whenever we're dealing with SOHCAHTOA, we can only deal with right triangles. So let's outline the right triangle that we have. So that would be right there. And then we want to find this angle. So we need to look at the sides that they give us. So they give us this 12 feet down here and this 6 feet on the other side there. So from this angle, from this x degrees, we need to determine what two sides we're dealing with. So this 12, well, that's right beside this angle, and it's not the hypotenuse because this over here would be the hypotenuse. Therefore, this side would be the adjacent side. And then this 6 feet would be the opposite side to angle x. So that's opposite of angle x. So they gave us the adjacent side and the opposite side. So we need to see out of SOHCAHTOA which one uses O and A for opposite and adjacent. Well, that would be the TOA or the tan equation. So in order to solve this problem, we are going to say the tan of x, or x degrees, is equal to, well, we need to put the opposite number over the adjacent number. So the opposite number is 6, so we're going to put that here, and then the adjacent is 12. So the tan of x is equal to 6 over 12. So then in order to solve this and actually calculate the angle, we need to use the inverse tan button on our calculator, because whenever we're calculating an angle, we need to use the inverse button. So we'll do inverse tan of 6 over 12. So then if you were to plug that into your calculator, you would put something like this button. So you might have to press the second function button to reach this button. And then you would put in the brackets 6 divided by 12. That's how we would enter this fraction, because this line means divided by. And if you do that, you should get 26.565 degrees. So Arya should cut at an angle of about, we'll round it up to 27 degrees. So please let me know if you're having any trouble putting this into your calculator and getting this answer. And please make sure that your calculator is in degree mode. So it has a little D on it somewhere, or maybe DEG. So that would be good. But if it has R or rad or G rad on it anywhere, that is no good. Okay, that will give you the incorrect answer. So these two are good. But if your calculator says rad or G rad, then that's no good. In this next example, it says that Shayna is a machinist. She uses a sine bar and gauge block to measure angles very accurately. For this project, the angle of elevation must be exactly 34.5 degrees. Which gauge block height should she use? Express your answer to 4 decimal places. So they kind of set up a right angle triangle in here where they gave us an angle, and then they gave us this length over here. So then we need to solve what this length is of the gauge block. So to start off, what we want to do is label our sides in regards to this angle. So if we're dealing with this side with the 5 on it, we would label that, well, that's right across from the right angle, so that would be the hypotenuse. And then the side over here with the question mark, well, that's opposite of this angle that we're dealing with. So I would label that as the opposite side. So then for this question, we're dealing with opposite and hypotenuse, or O and H. So when we're thinking about what we're going to use for SOHCAHTOA, we look for the one with an O and an H in it, and that would be SO. That has an O and an H. So then we're going to use sine in order to deal with this question. So in the solution, what we're going to do is we're going to put sine of 34.5 degrees is equal to, so we're dealing with the acronym so it's equal to opposite over hypotenuse. Now the opposite side, we don't know, right? We had a question mark there. So they just labeled it with an H in this question, but you could just label it with X or Y or whatever variable you want to use to represent that side. And then the hypotenuse would be the 5.0000. So then our next step to solve this question is we need to get that h all by itself so that we can solve for it. We need to isolate that variable. So right now it is getting divided by this 5.000. So in order to cancel out that 5.000, what we want to do is multiply this side by 5.0000. Because if we have something multiplying and dividing, they cancel each other out. But whatever we do to one side of the equal sign, we have to do to the other. So I'm also going to multiply this side by 5.0000. So that's why in the next step here, we end up with 5.0000 times sine of 34.5. And then what you're going to do is plug that into your calculator and solve for h. So if you were to plug that into your calculator, you will get that the height of the gauge block is 2.8320. Now keep in mind for this one, we aren't solving for an angle. We're solving for one of the side lengths of the triangle. So because of that, we are not using the inverse button. We are just using the regular sine button. In example 2, Vanessa needs to build a wheelchair ramp for a cottage in Whiteshell. The ramp must meet the porch 0.35 meters above the ground. The distance along the ground from the start of the ramp to the base of the porch must be 4.25 meters. What angle of elevation and ramp length should Vanessa use? So whenever you're given a question like this, it is important to draw a diagram to represent the problem. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw a porch. This is a porch. And we want to draw a ramp leading up to the porch. So in order to do that, I'm just going to start here and I'm going to put our ramp down to the ground. So that there is going to create our triangle. But now let's plug in some numbers. It says the ramp must meet the porch 0.35 meters above the ground. So this distance, this height over here is going to be 0.35 meters. And then it says the distance along the ground from the start of the ramp to the base of the porch must be 4.25 meters. So that says distance along the ground. So that's this number down here, 4.25 meters. So now that we set up this problem, it's asking what is the angle of elevation. So then we're going to think about our little guy sitting right here, standing here, looking straight outwards and then upwards. So this angle would be the angle of elevation we are looking for, x degrees. So we are given this 4.25. Well, in relation to this angle that we're working with, that would be the adjacent side of the triangle because it's not the hypotenuse, but it's the side that is beside the angle we're working with. So it's adjacent to it. And then if we're dealing with this 0.35, that would be the opposite side. So we have adjacent and we have opposite. So O and A, if we're dealing with SOHCAHTOA, which one has an O and A in it? Well, that would be TOA or tan. So we are going to be using tan for this one. So I'm going to put the tan of x degrees is equal to, well, it would be opposite over adjacent. So the opposite side here is 0.35 and the adjacent side is 4.25. So the tan of x is equal to 0.35 over 4.25. And now we are solving for an angle in this case. So whenever we solve for an angle, we have to use the inverse button on our calculator. So we're going to do the inverse tan, or tan -1, of 0.35 divided by 4.25. So if you're putting this into your calculator, you're going to do something like tan -1, 0.35 divided by 4.25. Now, depending on what calculator you are on, you might need to write this part first and then press inverse tan button. So if you plug this into your calculator correctly, your final answer will be that x is equal to 4.707 degrees. So then we'll round it up to the nearest full degree. So the angle of elevation should be about 5 degrees. The next part asks, is your answer reasonable, and explain why. So we will say that yes, it's reasonable because the angle must be small for safety reasons. So having it a small angle makes it so that the surface isn't too steep for the wheelchair to roll on. And then finally in part D, it wants us to use Pythagorean theorem to calculate the ramp length. So that would be a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. So I'm not going to use their fill in the blanks because I find them kind of tricky to work with. But if we look at our diagram up top, let's label our sides A, B, and C. So C is always the hypotenuse, and then A and B are the other two sides. So I'll just label this one A and this one B, but those two could be switched. So now let's plug in our numbers. We would have 4.25 squared plus 0.35 squared is equal to c squared. And now we're just going to keep solving. So 4.25 squared gives us 18.06, and 0.35 squared gives us 0.12. So that's equal to c squared. And then if we add these two together, we will get 18.18 is equal to c squared. And then our final step here would be to square root both sides of the equal sign so that we get rid of that squared beside the c. So we square root both sides, and our final answer should be 4.3 is equal to c. So then 4.3 would be the length of this ramp, and then we'll just plug that in down here. The ramp length should be 4.3 meters, and we won't do it to 2 decimal places. I only did it to 1 decimal place. So the ramp length should be 4.3 meters, and we'll just do it to 1 decimal place. We won't do 2. So please let me know if you have any questions using your calculator with SOHCAHTOA, with sine, cosine, and tangent.